Welcome, everyone, on that note, to this evening's Thinking, a home of one's own. What can we do about the housing crisis? The title is, of course, based on the title of this book here, which was written by Hashi Mohamed, who's sitting over there, is one of the two people that I want to welcome to talk to us today. Not so much you, actually, Hashi, because you're a contributing editor. We're very grateful for everything you've done for us over the past few months, years. But Hashi is a barrister, a broadcaster, as well as being a contributing editor to Tortoise, and the author of the book that we'll hopefully be talking quite a bit about this evening in the context of the question there. But also a welcome to Anna Minton, who's a writer and a journalist and a reader in architecture at UEL, but the author of Big Capital, Who is London For? Another book that contains, the themes are similar, the way you approach some of the questions are different, but I'm really excited to hear your points of view on the question that we're posing. Also really excited to hear what you all think. As Mark said at the beginning, we've got some microphones here at the front. I think someone's going to be in a position to pass them around. So please do, at any point, if you have thoughts, observations. I hope that everybody here has some relationship to the housing market in some shape or form, and therefore probably has an opinion. So please don't be shy. Just catch my eye and we'll get you a microphone. But to kick off, as I was sort of getting prepared for this conversation today, of course, it's hard to look past the news of Liz Truss's resignation, but there was a line in your book, Hashi, that is extremely relevant, I think, because it says, the decreasing quality of MPs, their lack of engagement with complex issues and technical details has played a role. It's played a role in the housing crisis, this is. Something which has worsened from 2015 onwards, only to become seriously acute post-2019. Where are we at now, Hashi, with that?
I wrote that a year ago.
Yeah. There's a really interesting point here, which I think is about how housing is so complicated. It reaches so many parts of our lives, economically, socially, politically, that you need a long-term strategy. You need consistency of thought about it. And this sort of, revolving door of responsibility for doing something about that strategy is a real issue. So I hope that's a sort of theme that we can come back to in the context of the big news today. But I actually wanted to start with the title, because there's an interesting story behind this and why you chose that phrase. Could you explain?
Yeah, the title was inspired by a book written by Virginia Woolf in 1929, and the book that she wrote is called A Room of One's Own. And Virginia Woolf is almost like, I would call it a feminist manifesto in relation to women who wanted to write but didn't have the space to write. And so in that essay, which I have to say some of it is a little bit incoherent because it feels like a rant, but actually it's a really coherent analysis of women not having the space to be able to do their work right. And so she talks about women in the 1920s never having a room of their own to be able to sit down and write. They share it with the children or other family members. They can never really aspire to be what they want to be. They don't have the opportunities to fulfill their potential. They will always struggle in the face of men. And she has this great line where she talks about, if ever Shakespeare had a sister and she ever wrote anything, we'd never know about it. And so I sort of remember reading that and thinking, so my analysis in this book is to kind of zoom out of the room and look at the home and say, actually, the fact that so many people are unable to have a home of their own is also holding back their potential and what they can and cannot do in society. So that's how it came about.
And you get very detailed and actually quite personal, which is another thing that's like it's a real joy of a book, even though it's extremely sort of sobering. Because it's rare to get so much sort of thoughtful personal analysis in sort of such a small package. But you make a real point of stressing, housing, it's sort of the foundation for stuff we wouldn't typically think of as an economic problem, but people's well-being, mental and physical, their ability to, have dreams and aspirations and to feel like they're in a space that is enabling them.
Exactly. And I remember what really got that for me was when I was growing up, we were living in sort of homeless council properties where we were constantly being moved around every couple of years because the council weren't able to house us in very decent accommodation not far from here, just in the borough of Brent, London borough of Brent. And that moment came to me because I remember going round to one of my really good friends' house one day to play some Nintendo. And I remember going into his room and I saw on his wall, he had a picture of Ronaldo, the footballer. And I remember thinking, I'd love to have a picture on the wall, but I might move next year. Mm-hmm. And that came back to me as I was writing this, because I thought, if you can't even put up a picture on a wall because you're thinking, I might not be here next year, what kind of precariousness does that do to your mental state, your ambitions, your sense of place, your sense of foundation, your friendships that you have, the corner shop that you might be used to down the road from you, the friendships that you build at school, the path that you use to walk to school. Every time we moved, I had to figure out how to walk to school, what was the quickest way to walk to, and everything that comes with that. And that's what I was trying to get to at that point.
Yeah. Well, you've said almost verbatim, which is not surprising, the line that's here. That idea that, actually your perception of how safe you are in an environment or what you should and shouldn't have relationships to, and so they're all calling upon this sense of being in a home, being housed. So I think we'd all agree, the stakes are extremely high in this conversation, and that makes the second part of this, what can we do about the housing crisis, really, really important. I wanted to turn to you, Anna, in a moment, because I've got in my notes, I've got the word solutions, : and then it's just blank. So hopefully there'll be some of that. No pressure. There'll be some of that comes on. But if we could talk a little bit in the kind of, economic sphere of this, about some of the forces that are driving what we call the housing crisis, having glossed, why it's important from a personal and health perspective. As you see it, what are we talking about when we talk about the housing crisis in this country specifically?
I mean, there's so many elements, and we've had a housing crisis my whole working life, and you're growing up in temporary accommodation, homeless, having to move all the time. That's absolutely terrible. And so we've lived with that for a very long time. But what's happened since 2008 and the financial crisis is we've moved into a sort of a new sphere, if you like, a sort of really acute housing crisis where we've got this soar away property price inflation, which is just affecting really nearly everybody. It's affecting the vast majority, and if it's not affecting them, it's affecting their children. Mm-hmm. It's affecting people can't buy homes, people can't rent homes. Property prices have just completely lost touch with reality. And that's fueled by, a whole host of issues. But it's the sorts of factors actually which came into play after the financial crisis.
There was a part that there are a bunch of very sort of striking stats in this. One of which I'm just trying to find. It's about the changing percentage of people who. Here we go. So we estimate that full-time employees could typically expect to spend about 9.1 times their workplace-based annual earnings on purchasing a home, and that is up from 7.9 times. So from 7.9 times to 9.1 times that figure, just since 2020. Yeah. So this is the word acute is
2 years.
Yeah, right. What does it look like a bit before that? Do you happen to know?
Well, if you look back to sort of the 70s and the 80s, this is what really frustrates me, and I'm sure we'll get to this about the older folk who just go, all these young people are spending their monies on avocados and Netflix, and if only they saved, they'd be fine. When what they fail to appreciate is if you were trying to buy your house in the 70s and the 80s, and certainly in the early 1990s, not only would you be buying a property in prime London for not an extortionate amount of money, but actually most banks would lend you for something probably 3 times your salary, 2 times your salary. And if you were 2 people, that was affordable. And I have my neighbours, literally about 10 doors down, a couple bought their house in 1972 for £24,000. It's now worth 1.1 million. £24,000 to 1.1 million. But they talk about that £24,000 being such an enormous amount of money to them at the time, which I appreciate and I understand. But that has zero relationship with the reality of what we face today.
Right. So that 7.9 to 9.1 just in the past few years, it's the tail end of an arc that's been going on for a long time. And so if we're looking out for the figures that really matter here to understand what the housing crisis is and particularly the price element of it, what have we got to look at? We've got to look at the rates for mortgages and the value of housing adjusted by...
Well, I think it's more fundamental than that. We have an economy that means that anyone who earns over £60,000, which is a huge amount of money, anyone who earns £60,000 is probably in the top 5%. Anyone who earns over £100,000 is like 0.5%, okay? So if you're earning the average salary in this country, which is like £26,000, £27,000, no bank's going to touch you. And what's ironic about that is that you're probably paying rent in a house for probably 3 times more than what you would be paying in a mortgage. So if you were living in London, renting out a room in a decent location, you're paying probably £1,000 for that room, okay, in a 3-bedroom place. But that whole property, if you managed to get a mortgage 5-10 years ago, the mortgage is probably not worth more than £1,000. And so the fundamental question I always ask people is, are the house prices that you are expecting people to buy, does that house price have any relationship with the market and the economy that you're asking them to participate in? And I take that example from Norway, Sweden, and those Scandinavian countries. You cannot pay somebody in Norway, Oslo, a very expensive place if you've ever been, a cleaner working in downtown Oslo, if she or he wants to live in downtown Oslo, the employer has to pay her not what he or she thinks is a decent salary, but you have to pay that person what they can afford to live to be able to work in that location.
And that's something that's enforced
by law. By law. So if you're expecting this person to clean your building or your house, or you're expecting them to work, you have to pay them a salary that is commensurate with that place and that location.
Yeah. So it would be good to try and unpick why we've ended up with that disconnect. What are your thoughts, Hannah?
Well, I mean, wages and growth
Yeah.
have just not kept pace in any shape or form with the property economy. You know, there's just a complete disconnect between those two. So, you know, if you're like me and you're lucky enough to have bought a flat in actually the late 1990s, I was able to do that on a, you know, fairly modest salary, 3 times my salary. I think I earned £30,000 at that time, and I could buy quite a reasonable place. And that has gone up, you know, that I bought that for under £100,000, and it's now worth £700,000. That same property, I don't live there, but you know, it shows you that differential. So I always say I earn far more by being asleep than actually I do in my job. You know, because So the property economy just operates on a sort of on a different level. And, it's inconceivable that we would intervene in, the way you're talking about in Oslo, that we'd say, oh, well, wages have to keep pace with that. I mean, it's perfectly possible to intervene in the economy and do all sorts with house price inflation and with other kinds of inflation. I mean, Germany, for example, hasn't witnessed any of this sort of inflation. Property prices have remained broadly stable while we've seen these huge rises. But it depends how you manage your economy. And we have allowed property really to take the lead. And I think in the last, post-financial crash, like I said, I think a combination of factors, probably 3 key factors: the sorts of properties we're building and who we're building them for. Yep. All of these luxury apartments which are being built all over London, a lot for foreign investment. Then we've got the impact of quantitative easing, which is the policy of creating trillions of pounds of new money, which we've repeatedly seen in the economy since the crash, which has massively boosted property price inflation.
Could you explain how that's happened?
Yeah, I mean, if I could really explain it, I'd probably have a very different kind of job and, be a very sought after person.
For people who are starting, what's the basic relationship between quantitative easing and...
I mean, quantitative easing was the policy, you're really putting me on the spot now,
Sorry.
Was the policy that was put in place by the Federal Reserve in the States, by the European Central Bank and the Bank of England to basically save the banks during the financial crisis, and they created trillions of pounds of money to save the banks from bankruptcy. And they printed 45 billion pounds, I think, between 2008 and 2016. And it was known to be quite a risky policy. And, the Bank of England wanted to wind it back, and it was known that it was inflationary. And Bank of England research has shown that it boosted what's called asset prices, and in particular, within those assets, property prices. It massively boosted property price inflation, and it went very much in the hands of the very richest people who ploughed it into property. Then in 2020, we actually had another massive round of quantitative easing because of the COVID pandemic. And in just that year alone, we had £650 billion of quantitative easing. So I think now what we're seeing actually is the inflationary impact of that tranche. And then just a couple of weeks ago, with the 65 billion that was used to basically save the pension funds, that was a very similar approach again. So we have this monetary policy which is actually massively inflationary. So it's really, really difficult to see how, while we've got that economic backdrop, we can do much about house price inflation. But having said that, there's a whole bunch of policies that we could seriously look at, like, building genuinely affordable homes for people that need them in the places that they need them, which we're not doing at all either. So while the sort of monetary picture looks, a bit overwhelming, there's all sorts of policies that we're not putting in place either.
So there's something that you get to, Hashi, in saying the scarcity of land on this island is also a major consideration, just to the point about building and where to build. But it's more accurately a question of the scarcity of land where people find it easier to build. So if it would be helpful for us, I think, to try and explain that problem of, where is there availability, where is there an availability crisis, and why can't we, marry those?
So one of the things I want to make clear is oftentimes people just reduce this issue down to it's all about building. It isn't as simple as just about building, because the reality of I'm a planning lawyer. I make a lot of money out of this complete and utter chaos. But the reality of what we face is that there are only a few places that are available to build on because of land constraints, the green belt, various protected sites, various European sort of protected sites that are legislatively harder to build on. And also about sustainability. Where can people catch trains to? Where can they commute to? Where are the jobs? Where are the kind of opportunities? And we just don't have that kind of vision that we had, for example, after the war of building whole new settlements like Stevenage, Welwyn Garden City, Letchworth Garden City. We just don't have those kind of visions of building whole new towns. And part of that problem is also because of our politics. I'm afraid to say it's the local councillors, and not this particular local councillor, but the local council level where the votes are in saying no. I wrote an article in the Sunday Times on Sunday just gone where I said that we have a situation where most local councillors now have built a coalition of the unwilling. And they're unwilling to build, they're unwilling to approve things, they're unwilling to do anything profound to fundamentally focus this issue. And the other thing that Anna's done really well in her book is, for me, we need to build the kind of houses for people who want to live and work here rather than just come and park their cash here. Because if you have a huge amount of capital, you don't want to put that in the stock market, but you want to put that in prime real estate in England. Because you know that the politics in England is completely dysfunctional. They're never going to build enough houses. And we're like 30 years behind anything profoundly moving in terms of changing things. And the last thing I'd say is I always say to people, the reason your house has gone up in so much in value wherever you are isn't because you live in a nicely gentrified area that now has gales. It's because people can't buy a house in anywhere where you live. And the reason it's gone up in price so quickly, so fast, in such a short space of time, has got nothing to do with that lovely new kitchen island that you've got, but it's because every year that goes by, fewer and fewer people can afford to buy a house where you live.
Yeah.
That's the key. You know, people need to understand that.
Yeah. Please do, like I said at the beginning, just raise your hand if you've got thoughts and stuff. But again, there's a brilliant line here. You say we've essentially got a cartel.
It is a cartel.
Of volume house builders who operate in a particular way, and there are all sorts of unhappy consequences.
They're my clients too.
Right.
I'll give you one statistic.
Yeah.
Can you imagine in this country, there are 6 major house builders? 6 companies. 6 companies control the majority of house building in this country. Are you telling me they're not talking to each other? Are you telling me they're not colluding? Are you telling me they're not communicating? Are you telling me that they're not playing one council against the other, one politician against the other? And crucially, they're not in any rush to build. I did a documentary for Radio 4 where I put it to the representative of the house builders. I said, the reality is you will only build as quickly or as slowly as you can actually sell these houses. And he said, yeah, true. On BBC Sounds, it's there. And so what are we meant to do now? How are we supposed to participate in that economy when our politicians don't make the decisions? They won't touch the green belt. They won't touch the areas of so-called outstanding natural beauty. The green belt seems to have this bizarre concept in this mindset of the British people that it's some sort of green and pleasant land, when so much of the green belt is nothing short of, it's not green at all, and most of it isn't pleasant. And so it's just like craziness that is causing this massive block. And the last thing I'd say is my answer isn't just build. It's really having a strategic mind about what we want, when we want it, who do we want it for, and crucially, how do we build in a sustainable way and offer these properties to people who can actually live in them, want to live in them, and are earning money in that local economy that they can afford to pay that rent.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the, I suppose it's like the political inertia that you're describing, this sort of unwillingness to move there. And that again, it's a point here that you make saying 39% of Conservative MPs were landlords.
Can you imagine? 39% of Conservative MPs are landlords. Now, are you telling me they're going to want to build more housing?
Yeah. And then the point that the national average is 2%. So it's a hugely anomalous rate of home ownership amongst the people who are, responsible for setting a policy that doesn't just maximise the value of houses being sold on the market, but actually does something to address the myriad problems that come from insecure, the housing crisis. Yeah.
Anyway, so I could keep going about, but in a country of 60 million, when you have 2% of people are landlords, and in a tiny minority of groups in Parliament, 39% of them are landlords.
Yeah.
What more do you need to know?
Please, sir, do you want to tell us who you are and
Sure,
what you think?
Curly, founding member of Tortoise and local borough councillor. And I live...
Tell us where you are in particular.
I live in Epsom and Ewell, and I am on the planning committee, and I'm a portfolio holder for housing and homelessness, and I am a member of the longest running independent held council in England since 1937. So we had a great chat after the last thinking. So we talked about silver-haired NIMBYs, which I get what you're saying.
Can you say that again?
Silver-haired NIMBYs.
I mentioned it last time because when I go to planning inquiries where we're trying to build housing, there's always like a massive audience of people who want to say no. And I always love it because you look at the audience and they've all got silver hair.
Right.
Which tells you what you need to know.
We had the BBC come to our planning committee a couple of months ago and did what I would regard as a hatchet job on...
I saw that. Mark Easton.
On us, yeah. And it was interesting to see a guy a developer in the report that we never got to meet, talking about the housing he wanted to build. And it later came up that his company is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, I think, one of the very, very big house builders. And they were saying, poor man, the risk he's going through to do all of this, and he's part of this multi-billion global conglomerate. And you think, okay, that's interesting. They didn't mention that in the report. And they also didn't contact any councillors for a comment, even though they said no one would speak to them. So you do get a sense of this, and I'm not particularly media trained, but you do get a sense of the perception on you. So I think the bit that stuck out from some of our conversations was that, sure, there are problems, particularly in places like Surrey, in the home counties, where you've got very, very high green belt, proper green belt, not some road aggregate covered by grass, which is what I live opposite, which is not green belt. So I get that. I think 42% of my borough's green belt, proper, ancient woodland and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're adverse to taking some of that out, but you then get into other difficulties. So I was reading about the new Secretary of State for, hopefully he's still in post, hopefully not he's still in post because of some of the stuff he wants to do, and I don't agree with it. But Simon Clarke talks about, let's just get rid of biodiversity net gain, let's make it much easier to build housing. Let's, basically forget about habitat protection, forget about bringing in controls on pollution and what you can put in the soil, all the rest of it. And that's quite frightening when you think about you want to do green belt release, you want to build housing, we desperately need it, we know that. It's really expensive where I live, one of the least affordable places in the country to buy. I was 37 when I got on the housing ladder, gigantic mortgage, terrifying.
So those things that you just listed, how many of them, scrapping biodiversity, net gain, etc., do you have to do in order to build property in a place?
So as part of, if it ever gets off the ground, as part of the planning legislation the government said for several years it wants to bring forwards.
These are just proposals for now.
Mm-hmm. Right. They've talked about biodiversity net gain, which means that when a developer comes in, you have to leave the biodiversity in a better state than you found it. And each local authority can make decisions about the percentage. I think 10% is. Yeah. So the problem with that is that it can be converted into credits in theory, but like carbon credits, they never manifest. They just sit in a bank account and the developers can buy. So you could just pour concrete over the whole of the home counties, but you would have complied with biodiversity net gain because you bought credits, or you've offset it. You've put some mud flats somewhere in the northeast and said, there you go, ta-da, and there's nothing there anyway. So I think there's lots of questions about that. So the sustainability, the environment side of it, as well as infrastructure. I'm living in the most densely populated borough in Surrey. Again, people think of Surrey as being just this sort of just golf courses, but the electrical grid regularly has problems. The water systems regularly have problems. Various other issues like that. The buses and trains are always horribly overcrowded. The school my daughters go to. In 2012, they had to build a school the same size next to it just to cope with what was coming in that year. It's grown since then.
The point you're making that's because of the restrictions that apply to building.
I'm trying to make the point that when you live somewhere that's already creaking, that's already heaving at the seams, and you don't have the schools, you don't have the leisure or sports facilities, the water table is, on its last legs, the power supply is unreliable. What has to happen? And sure, there's infrastructure levies and there's various things that developers have to pay into when they successfully win planning permission and build a development. But it's nowhere near enough to actually keep up with. And we've got the worst potholes in the country as another issue.
Can I jump in and make a point? Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Well, I was going to finish, please.
Yeah, go for it. Oh. No, all I was going to say is I completely understand what you're saying about all the pressures that you're facing in your local area, and how a lot of the developments are possibly unsuitable. I think that's sort of broadly what you're saying, and I also completely understand what you're saying about the silver NIMBYs or however you silver-haired NIMBYs, but we do need more housing for sale in greenbelt areas. We do, but I don't think, for me, I'm going to sort of disagree with you a bit. I'm going to say I don't think that's the main issue. I think that's the sort of the story, which is that, if we basically manage to get over this, difficult planning system, and, if the NIMBYs would just stop causing all these problems, and if we could only build the amount of housing that people need, prices would come down. And I just, that's just not the story, really.
I agree, but what do you think is the main bit?
Well, I mean, I almost would say that's a sort of small part of the story, because when we've got this massive kind of economic backdrop, it's not going to make really much difference. But also, there are all sorts of other things that we could do if we were going to take a different approach. So when, you say there's not much land, well, actually, between them, local authorities, NHS estates, Transport for London,
Church of England,
they have huge amounts of land, absolutely huge amounts of land, but they are forbidden pretty much from doing anything with that land except making, commercial considerations come absolutely top. And they have to use that land to maximise investment potential by going into partnerships with people who build lots of luxury apartments that no local people can afford and will be sold straight to foreign investors. So I tend to see that as the sort of overriding obstacle.
So do you want to tell us, was it your view that whilst those other things are so problematic, water table, et cetera, we're not going to see meaningful action on building additional housing?
Well, let me tell you a brief but very sad story from my last planning committee last month, where a site that has come up for many, many years, decade and a half now, it used to be a pub, then it was a Thai restaurant, business failed, demolished. Corner plot, dual carriageway, desirable area, right next to a huge nature reserve. Got planning permission, quite controversially, for housing, largely because of our housing targets are very high and we're struggling to hit them, but because it had 12 affordable properties in that development, which is incredibly hard to get. The developers always say it's not viable. We can't do the build, can't afford to do it with that. Went through, quite controversial, bit taller than everything else in the area. Lots of angst amongst my colleagues in the community. The successful applicant immediately sold the property with planning permission, quite cynically, onto the highest bidder. And that then came back to committee last month with the new applicant saying he'd gone to 12 affordable housing providers, 9 hadn't responded, 2 said they couldn't do it, and 1 it had fallen through.
And now he wants to make it commercial.
And now he wants to put a care home in there.
Care home.
Yeah. So C2 care home. So what's happening where I live right now? The local hospital, massive site, has been hundreds of beds for a care home. Where the police station used to be, ambulance station, fire station, church, care homes. Legal & General's headquarters in Kingswood down the road, hundreds of beds, care homes. Banstead Village, pretty much all care homes. So you go, okay, right, what point do we get to oversupply? So when you talk about Silverhead, NIMBYs, the planning committee is being told there's no material consideration for you to turn this down. You've already agreed a much larger build on this site. Now you've got to put a care home there because the applicant cynically thinks they can make more money out of old people selling up their old houses to move into that care home.
Yeah, that's happening everywhere.
What do we do?
Yeah. Do you want to just...
What do we do?
Well, I mean, the thing about the thing I find really frustrating, I do a lot of work around Hertfordshire. St Albans, for example, is a place that hasn't had a local plan. Local plans being the document that allows you to figure out how much housing you're going to need, how much employment you're going to need for a generation, 25 years. St Albans hasn't had a plan since 1994. And that means that they really haven't built much, and there's a huge amount of greenbelt. So I go there and I try and convince the councils to get a local plan. They say no. Now they're all living, 2 people, 7-bedroom houses, 5-bedroom houses that are worth millions. What are people like Legal & General and all the care home providers thinking? There are all these people who are living in £1 million houses. We can get them to sell the £1 million houses, get insurance, and they can move into these lovely new plush care homes. So that's the business. But then when you go to a planning inquiry in St Albans for normal housing or affordable housing, we don't want that riffraff, or the silverhead turn up saying no. You come forward with a really high-end care home, and they all turn up and go, ooh, can we get a cinema in there? It's crazy. And so that generation of the baby boomers, I don't want to generalize again, they've all been able to buy their properties at like dead cheap. They're all worth huge amount of money. They stopped all building for normal people. And then now they're about to get into that age of retirement stroke care home. They're willing to say yes to things that are only in their interest.
And they have
insane.
An outsized degree of control over the decision making.
And they vote.
Yeah.
They lobby. They have capital.
So there's a piece you write here on the millennial inheritance boom. Just to this point about whether there's going to be a generational shift or the generational issue, as it were, that plays into the housing crisis. On the millennial inheritance boom that will occur when the baby boomer generation begin to die off, releasing their wealth into the next generation, who will themselves be getting on a bit. The average age of inheritance is projected to be 61. 61 isn't that far off needing the retirement.
I don't know if I put it in the book. I agree with you. I don't know if I put it in the book, but just think about people like Prince Charles, who's been waiting to inherit.
That was almost
it's exactly the same thing.
Right.
It's exactly the same thing. I don't know what you were trying to say something just a second ago. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So Paul Atherton, for those who know me, I've been homeless in central London for 13 years now. I lost my home due to a credit file error. So I used to live. I'm the archetype example of what you've been discussing today. I bought my first flat when I was in my early 20s at 38,500. I paid more for my first car when I moved to London than for the first flat that I owned. I then moved on to the river, and I lived on the river for the entire duration from 2000 to 2009. I never paid more than £800 a month. So I was living in the White House, which had an underground pool, terrace overlooking the London Eye, views over St Paul's, and that was costing me and a flatmate £800 each. That now rents out at £76,000 a year. That's how insane the market is, and there's no correlation. But I think the important thing to remember is that the housing market is, as we mentioned, is fake. It doesn't exist. There's no reality to it at all. It's not controlled by supply and demand. We see over in Vauxhall, two-thirds of the flats that have been built haven't even been sold. So it's not like somebody money boxing. It's not somebody going, I'll buy it and just leave it as an ascending asset. They literally can't sell them. But still we have planners across central London, issuing tower block edicts. And I think my favorite one about the Vauxhall one is that they're affordable housing, which means you have to go through the pour door, can't use the pool, can't do anything within the building, start at £700,000. That's their affordable housing. So we have over 1 million properties in Britain that are vacant right now. That would end homelessness tomorrow. If we occupied those and put them back in the market in a variety of ways, we see NHS buildings lying vacant, we see these luxury buildings not being sold, that would literally eradicate the problem overnight. And I think that's really where the focus needs to be, that we have to accept that the housing market is broken, that there is no such thing.
I say that in the book. The housing market is a complete and utter... There was a really interesting research that came out in the Times 2 weeks ago. I'd urge you all to look at it. Really fantastic research that came out from Oxford University. And they said that the property market and the housing market in England is overpriced by about 34, 36%. And as I said, again, the inflation that exists that you're talking about, the housing in this country in particular, has got very little to do with how much of a lovely house that you live in with a lovely kitchen and a lovely sort of whatever, but has more to do with the fact that there are 1,000 people trying to get your house at the same time. And that is fundamentally the crucial thing to understand. And the other thing, the two other thoughts that I wanted to kind of make clear. I also say in the book, we shouldn't really be obsessed about buying. That's rich for coming from me or anybody who is on the property ladder. But if we can find a way, in the short term at least, of making the security of tenure in renting a bit stronger, people can have a bit of a breather. Otherwise, the people who are renting are, to me, as much in insecure housing as anybody who's homeless. Yeah. Because every year, the moment you walk in, 6 months down the road, your landlord could just tell you, mate, see you later. And a year after that, he's going to put up the rent.
I mean, equally, renting is an impossible situation at the moment.
Exactly.
It's impossible to rent a home. But just to come back to your point on affordable housing, which is a massively important point that you made about the price of affordable housing. I mean, everything we've been talking about, massive inflation, macroeconomic picture, planning, etc. All those things are really important. They're hugely important, but actually so is policy. And the definition of affordable housing was changed in 2010 to mean up to 80%
of the market.
Of market value, hence your prices.
How is that actually an average market value?
So whatever it is, 80% of, instead of 100%.
If in your block, a property...
Yeah. Where there's 800,000.
Exactly. Affordable housing, they have to provide 25%.
I would say affordable to who?
So that's a hugely important point. So if, as policymakers, if the decision is that's the definition, that's your starting point.
I'm so sorry. I did just indicate to him that we would go back, but I'll get back to you in a moment. Hi.
Hi. So I'm Finn. I'm an economics student, and housing is one of the areas I'm really interested in. But it's actually not really on many economics curriculums, unfortunately, and it really should be because of how serious it is. But I was lucky enough to take a module which touched on this. And I think one of the really important things that I learned, which hasn't been mentioned, is that what's really key to this issue is the interplay between the financial sector and the housing market. I mean, we've said a lot tonight about how the housing market is broken. The financial sector is one of the main reasons for that. 100%. And I think the first thing you've got to understand is we've talked about the Bank of England creating money through quantitative easing, but the vast majority of money is created by private banks. When you get a mortgage, that money isn't being transferred over from savers. It's being created on the spot. And it's being created because banks make money by creating it and loaning it out. So we're kind of living in an economy whereas if this room was the economy and say houses are built at a cost of 150,000 and you lend everyone £200,000 to buy a house, that's the price that houses would go for. But if instead banks turn around and say we'd make more money by lending £1 million to everyone to buy a house, then that's the prices that houses go for. Exactly. So it's completely disconnected from the actual value of the house. It's costs, I don't know what's happened to costs, but it's all about kind of the finance and the lack of regulation that allows banks to lend ridiculous amounts of money. In fact, until 2008, and possibly since, I'm not completely up to date, banks were actively encouraged to lend to houses because it was seen as less risky than other business investments. And yeah, we saw how that turned out. And, you know, also in the context of the current government going off about growth, you know, one way to actually create growth is making sure that the credit that banks do create go into things like businesses which actually produce value. Whereas if houses get more expensive, it's the same house. There's no more value there.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's.
Thank you. Can we go to you in a moment? And we're running dangerously low on time to solve such an elephant problem. So I'd love to hear what you had to say, and then.
Yeah, we were talking about policy and renting, and I know you took it away from renting, and I spend most of my time thinking about the rental sector. Jamie Campbell, by the way, and something that I've always something that I've wrestled with recently and really struggled to wrestle with is the need for a, private rented sector to exist. Because if it dropped off a cliff, then, the lack of housing would be incredibly dramatic. And the reforms that are proposed by the previous government or current government, but in its previous form, being, to sway the power slightly more in the favor of renters, which I think for anyone who's renting is very happy to hear. But for anyone who's a landlord or an asset holder in that market, they're thinking, hang on a second, this is getting a bit too difficult now. So I'm very keen to just offload my properties. Obviously, that just lowers the amount of properties available to rent, and therefore drives the demand up. And now that less people can be first-time buyers, especially with mortgage rates the way that they are, I really struggle to square the circle of, I want there to be more protections for renters in the rental market. Obviously, who doesn't? But it seems like now is such a trepidatious time, because progressive regulation and progressive policies like that almost, and you look at Scotland, could kind of be detrimental to the position of renters in the market, which is really dangerous. And I was curious to hear your opinion, because it's a very odd scenario where, morally I know where I lie, but kind of,
So are you suggesting that we'll reach a swinging point where the majority of people who have been landlords to tenants would say this is too much faff, or it's too onerous to me, or I'm not making enough money? They would sell on their house to someone who wasn't going to operate it as a rented property.
There's been a net decline in private rented properties in London, definitely, but across the UK,
George Osborne's tax changes
That's made a difference.
made a big difference, and landlords did pull out of the private rented sector.
Do you want to? Well, this will be, by my standards, relatively quick. There were just two things. One was I just wanted to share something that just completely blew my mind this year, which I was talking to a former chancellor, and I appreciate there are quite a lot of them about these days. But we were talking about the food economy and how we are reliant on incredibly cheap food that is extremely unhealthy, both for our land economy and for large numbers of people. And he said to me, well, but we have to have very cheap food because we need to protect the housing market. And I said, I don't understand what you mean. He said, well, if you look at the price of and the cost of housing in the UK by comparison with, let's say, Germany, we have to have very, very low cost food, and hence some of the issues we have around health and obesity, because people's spending disproportionately goes into their housing.
Into rent and...
rent or mortgages.
Yeah.
I thought it was amazing because he could see it. He'd heard the arguments from Justin King, which were, let's put VAT on food and we're going to change the dynamics around food. And he said, no, we're invested in essentially those house prices. And so that was really the question I had, Anna, for you and Hashi, which was the one thing I don't get right now is if you go to a higher interest rate environment and you do see a crack in the housing market to the tune of 10 to 20%, if you do see falls in house prices, I assume that the whole thing you've been describing is soaring housing prices being bad for people. Why do I suspect that falling housing prices will be bad for people too? I don't know who
I think
benefits.
falling house prices would be great, personally.
It depends.
I'll tell you my
gonna
thoughts.
hit.
I'll tell you my thoughts in a moment. Sorry. Do you want to get the question? Anna and I might disagree.
You might be coming to the crux of it. I was going to ask the question. We've talked a lot about problems, but we haven't got to many solutions yet. Surely one of the solutions is building council houses on land that councils own, because the land value is then already...
The land value is a big question over that, yeah, absolutely.
So can we talk about whether we can reintroduce that a bit more? Because that's what was lost over the last 40 years.
I can give you loads of ideas. So, number one, give the opportunity for councils. But councils used to be able to borrow against future houses that they're going to build. So they were able to go to the bank and go, we're going to build 1,000 houses in the next 5 years. Do you want to give us money and leverage that money against future houses? They can't do that anymore. We need more building policies that allow that to happen. But then the issue is we don't have enough construction, we don't have enough materials. That's a big issue, part of it. We need to curtail massively, I would suggest, foreign ownership of properties and land in this country. That's a big part of the inflation that we're dealing with. I would suggest that we take out a huge amount of the politics in terms of the decision making. We already have the mechanisms for that. Big infrastructure projects, airports, big roads, big networks. Politicians don't get a hand on that because it's part of what's called a Development Consent Orders, DCO, national infrastructure. If we declassify housing and say that it's an infrastructure issue, that could allow us to make decisions with respect, councillors getting involved. And then also think about other infrastructure when we think, in the 1950s, housing was considered a public health issue. That tells you everything you need to know. And that's the kind of thing, and capital, I could keep going. There's loads of ideas I put in the book, but there's loads of potential, but it really requires the political balls to do it.
Well, that's the key question. And actually, councils can now build council housing. Southwark Council has built 1,000 council homes, but it is difficult. It needs to be made easier. But even Michael Gove, when he was levelling up,
he was interesting.
He said we do need to build a lot more social housing. Recently, the politicians have been recognising this, and yet it still doesn't happen, And as you said, that's so interesting, isn't it? Actually, the former Chancellor said, we have to keep the property economy going because it's the property economy that's powering this dysfunctional economy. And they can't see how another way around it. But to answer the question about falling house prices, dispassionately, falling house prices are a really good idea.
100%.
Of course they are. But in the real world, this is going to kill millions of people who are going to be paying £600, £700 more a month on their mortgages. They're not going to be able to afford that with, long-term higher interest rate scenario, negative equity. That level of kind of economic catastrophe is, also got to be sort of part of the picture. So, yeah, of course, we want house prices to come down, but we should have managed them down. We should have set out to do that rather than having a crashing economy. That's really not a good scenario.
That's not a good scenario, but that's the reality of what we face now. That's the thing. And I...
Having said that, even so, I'm still not sure if it's going to happen because of I
agree with you.
Quantitative easing and those factors.
It won't happen because so many people are on this merry-go-round now. So many people are invested in this unsustainable situation that to allow it to crash is just not going to happen in many respects, but it should happen.
It's electoral suicide as well, but it needs to be managed down in a policy, with foresight.
The last thing I'd say is the council houses that we do hopefully end up building, no help to buy, no right to buy. Those houses stay as housing stock controlled by the council for people who need it, and because that's one of the biggest, worst decisions ever made. The two things, if you take anything away from this talk, the two biggest catastrophes that's happened in this country one was the right to buy, and the second was people's mindsets shifting from the home being a place you live to it being an investment and a commodity. Those two things aligning is what's brought us to this situation. People always talk about we're not building enough housing and all the rest of it. That's all a sideshow. Those two things are what has brought us to where we are.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And that's
please,
a uniquely British problem too.
Excuse me, my name is Paul Swain, and from the earlier conversation, I think I'm personally responsible for most of the problems. Because I'm in my late 70s and I bought my first house in 1971.
So you own a green belt?
No, it wasn't in the green belt. But I absolutely agree with what you're saying. But when I bought my house in 1971, I didn't buy it as an investment.
Exactly.
I bought it
Because you want to live.
because it's somewhere to live. Yeah. And one of the reasons I bought a house was because it was a step up the social ladder. Living in rented accommodation was a bit déclassé.
No roots.
Yeah. But it wasn't with the anticipation of making a fortune, which I ultimately did. So is there some way of changing this perception? Somebody earlier mentioned prices in Germany, for example, being much lower. Paying rent in Germany is perfectly respectable and always has been, as in France and many continental countries. Why does everybody have to aspire to owning a house? Which, of course, is the aspiration that Margaret Thatcher was building on with the right to buy.
That was what she thought, that if you can get people to buy, they would want to conserve the situation and conserve the status and become conservatives. That was the idea. That was the whole purpose of that.
But the other point about the difference between this country and Germany, for example, is could the fact that our economy is less productive than the German economy be related to the fact that so much investment is in useless bricks and mortar?
Yeah. Well, I always argue, and I've said in the book, that we don't make anything anymore. We're not a country that produces any natural resources. And our natural resources actually is either in our people or in our walls. And apart from the financial services and the services industry, which make up 75% of our economy, what else have we got going for us? That's the key. And the properties and the buildings, commercial, rented, whatever you call it, is where our wealth is. Yeah. That's it.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. If anybody who hasn't read this book, I'd massively urge you to, not least because in conclusion, you write, Hashi, at the moment we have endless interfering, very little accountability and sustainability. We certainly cannot solve the housing crisis unless there's political impetus, will and determination to confront the problem, including tackling these difficult and unpopular decisions. And that means when reform is proposed and legislation is drafted, the decisions taken to implement them have to have a clear aim of ensuring lives and livelihoods. And this is in contrast to, ensuring appreciating assets, and have to be aimed at improving a lot for the majority. So there was some very practical stuff that you mentioned at the end, and that's where I'd say, grapple with this book. Perhaps actually the beginning of the solution is for more people to be aware of some of these arguments, and to talk more openly about them. It's been extremely interesting. I feel like we're not even close to done, but unfortunately, the Agatha has reached the end of her journey. So it's just left to me to say thank you so much, Anna, Hashi, everybody who's weighed in, and we hope to see you again soon.